In this tutorial I'm going to explain how to connect Scope up to your DAW using the ScopeSync system. First thing I'm going to do is add a modular patch to the routing window. So I'm going to use the 4x4 BC modular shell, which is a particularly good choice for ScopeSync due to the fact that it's got a pair of stereo ins and outs. We'll be using one of that pair for the ScopeSync data connection, and the other is then available for us to use for audio in and out. Okay, so that's all hooked in there. You'll notice that I used ASIO1 float source and float dest. We recommend using 32-bit connections, which is what these provide, as they offer the highest resolution for the control signal. We have tested it using 16 and 24-bit connections and it works fine, but obviously the control signals won't be as high a resolution. So moving across into our patch, the first thing I need to do here is add the ScopeSync controller. You'll see here it's got 128 outputs. Each of those allows you to control an individual asynchronous control within the modular patch. This host connection, which we connect to the control panel, allows us to make or to control the patch from the ScopeSync panel. And I'll demonstrate what you can do with that in a second. The data and the destination, both in and out, are where the ScopeSync signals go. And that's what actually controls the async channels. And that's essentially all that's required in the patch to get the ScopeSync module hooked in. So I'm going to close the routing window now and open up the ScopeSync panel. So you'll see we've got a default loader here, which doesn't have any encoders or buttons or anything like that, but it does have some header controls, which include the ability to open and close the patch window. So I'll demonstrate that there. And it also allows us to open and close the preset window, which if it wasn't hiding on the other side you'd see. So now you can see that. So I want to load a configuration, but because we've only recently installed, we haven't actually got any configurations in there. So I'm going to add the default set which comes with ScopeSync. Those are found in the directory you installed ScopeSync. So in my case I use the default, which is Program Files ScopeSync. Closing that window then automatically reloads the library, and I'm going to pick the template 16, which is the simplest of the templates that we provide. And you'll see there a 16 encoder configuration, and for each of the encoders it's got a ScopeSync ID which refers to the connector within the ScopeSync module. Okay, so now moving across to connecting up in the DAW. So I'm using Reaper here, so this is a good example of a DAW to use with ScopeSync. It's got good flexible routing. So I'll add a track and I'll set up the ins and outs to start with. So within here I first of all need to disable the master parent send, because otherwise we'll run into problems whereby the control signals are sent as audio, which is not particularly pleasant sounding. And then I need to add a hardware output. I'll come back to that in a sec. I think I'll add the input first. So now we've got the output showing. Not sure why that was, but there we go. So the inputs and outputs are now going to 15 and 16 to the channels that we set them up for. Next I need to arm the track, set the monitoring mode, and then finally actually load the VST. So I'll load that as an input effects, and the reason I do that is to allow the bidirectional control. So select ScopeSync, and you'll see we get the same screen that we saw in Scope. Same configuration chooser, I'm going to pick the template 16 again. So now we have matching controls on both sides. So hopefully if all's well, I'll be able to turn the control here and you'll see it moving at the bottom there. Now I mentioned bidirectional control. It's not continuous bidirectional control. So if I move the control here, it's not going to move the control on the DAW side. However, I can make changes over here and then hit the snapshot button, and that will send updates of those controls, which is useful for preset recall, and situations where you've set up a patch on the scope side and you want to push the control messages across. So essentially that's all there is really to it. In later tutorials I'll talk a lot more about how to actually set up specific dedicated parameters and how to map those, and also how to override the style of your templates.